Chapter 13 of The Sleeper Awakes. The End of the Old Order. So far as Graham was able to judge, it was near midday when the white banner of the council fell. But some hours had to elapse before it was possible to effect the formal capitulation, and so, after he had spoken his word, he retired to his new apartments in the wind-vane offices. The continuous excitement of the last 12 hours had left him inordinately fatigued. Even his curiosity was exhausted. For a space he sat inert and passive with open eyes, and for a space he slept. He was roused by 2 medical attendants, come prepared with stimulants to sustain him through the next occasion. After he had taken their drugs and bathed by their advice in cold water, he felt a rapid return of interest and energy, and was presently able and willing to accompany Ostrog through several miles, as it seemed, of passages, lifts, and slides, to the closing scene of the White Council's rule. The way ran deviously through a maze of buildings. They came at last to a passage that curved about and showed broadening before him an oblong opening, clouds hot with sunset, and the ragged skyline of the ruinous council house. A tumult of shouts came drifting up to him. In another moment they had come out high up on the brow of the cliff of torn buildings that overhung the wreckage. The vast area opened to Graham's eyes, none the less strange and wonderful for the remote view he had had of it in the oval mirror. This rudely amphitheatral space seemed now the better part of a mile to its outer edge. It was gold-lit on the left hand, catching the sunlight, and below and to the right clear and cold in the shadow. Above the shadowy grey council house that stood in the midst of it, the great black banner of the surrender still hung in sluggish folds against the blazing sunset. Severed rooms, halls, and passages gaped strangely. Broken masses of metal projected dismally from the complex wreckage. Vast masses of twisted cable dropped like tangled seaweed, and from its base came a tumult of innumerable voices, violent concussions, and the sound of trumpets. All about this great white pile was a ring of desolation, the smashed and blackened masses, the gaunt foundations and ruinous lumber of the fabric that had been destroyed by the council's orders, skeletons of girders, titanic masses of wall, forests of stout pillars. Amongst the somber wreckage beneath, running water flashed and glistened, and far away across the space, out of the midst of a vague, vast mass of buildings, there thrust the twisted end of a water main, 200 feet in the air, thunderously spouting a shining cascade, and everywhere great multitudes of people. Wherever there was space and foothold, people swarmed, little people, small and minutely clear, except where the sunset touched them to indistinguishable gold. They clambered up the tottering walls, they clung in wreaths and groups about the high-standing pillars, they swarmed along the edges of the circle of ruins. The air was full of their shouting, and they were pressing and swaying towards the central space. The upper stories of the council house seemed deserted. Not a human being was visible. Only the drooping banner of the surrender hung heavily against the light. The dead were within the council house, or hidden by the swarming people, or carried away. Graham could see only a few neglected bodies in gaps and corners of the ruins, and amidst the flowing water. "Will you let them see you, sire?" said Ostrog. "They are very anxious to see you." Graham hesitated, and then walked forward to where the broken verge of wall dropped sheer. He stood looking down, a lonely, tall, black figure against the sky. Very slowly the swarming ruins became aware of him, and as they did so, little bands of black uniformed men appeared remotely, thrusting through the crowds towards the council house. He saw little black heads become pink looking at him, saw by that means a wave of recognition sweep across the space. It occurred to him that he should accord them some recognition. He held up his arm, then pointed to the council house, and dropped his hand. The voices below became unanimous, gathering volume, came up to him as a multitudinous wavelets of cheering. The western sky was a pallid bluish-green, and Jupiter shone high in the south before the capitulation was accomplished. Above was a slow, insensible change, the advance of night, serene and beautiful. Below was hurry, excitement, conflicting orders, pauses, spasmodic developments of organization, a vast ascending clamor and confusion. Before the council came out, toiling, perspiring men, directed by a conflict of shouts, carried forth hundreds of those who had perished in the hand-to-hand conflict within those long passages and chambers. Guards in black lined the way that the council would come, and as far as the eye could reach into the hazy blue twilight of the ruins, and swarming now at every possible point in the captured council house and along the shattered cliff of its circumadjacent buildings, were innumerable people, and their voices, even when they were not cheering, were as the soughing of the sea upon a pebble beach. Ostrog had chosen a huge, commanding pile of crushed and overthrown masonry, and on this a stage of timbers and metal girders was being hastily constructed. Its essential parts were complete, but humming and clangorous machinery still glared fitfully in the shadows beneath this temporary edifice. The stage had a small, higher portion on which Graham stood with Ostrog and Lincoln close beside him, a little in advance of a group of minor officers. A broader lower stage surrounded this quarter-deck, and on this were the black uniformed guards of the revolt, armed with the little green weapons, whose very names Graham still did not know. Those standing about him perceived that his eyes wandered perpetually from the swarming people in the twilight ruins about him to the darkling mass of the white council house, whence the trustees would presently come, and to the gaunt cliffs of ruin that encircled him, and so back to the people. The voices of the crowd swelled to a deafening tumult. He saw the councillors first afar off in the glare of one of the temporary lights that marked their path, a little group of white figures in a black archway. In the council house they had been in darkness. He watched them approaching, drawing nearer, past first this blazing electric star, and then that. The minatory roar of the crowd, over whom their power had lasted for 150 years, marched along beside them. As they drew still nearer, their faces came out weary, white, and anxious. He saw them blinking up through the glare about him and Ostrog. He contrasted their strange, cold looks in the halls of Atlas. Presently he could recognize several of them. The man who had rapped the table at Howard, a burly man with a red beard, and one delicate-featured, short, dark man with a peculiarly long skull. He noted that two were whispering together and looking behind him at Ostrog. Next there came a tall, dark, and handsome man, walking downcast. Abruptly he glanced up. His eyes touched Graham for a moment and passed beyond him to Ostrog. The way that had been made for them was so contrived that they had to march past and curve about before they came to the sloping path of planks that ascended to the stage where their surrender was to be made. "The Master! The Master! God and the Master!" shouted the people. "To hell with the council!" Graham looked at their multitudes, receding beyond counting into a shouting haze, and then at Ostrog beside him, white and steadfast and still. His eye went again to the little group of white councillors, and then he looked up at the familiar quiet stars overhead. The marvelous element in his fate was suddenly vivid. Could that be his indeed, that little life in his memory 200 years gone by, and this as well? End of Chapter 13. Recording by Robert Flock, www.allauthors.com.
Chapter 14. From the Crow's Nest. And so, after strange delays, and through an avenue of doubt and battle, this man from the 19th century came at last to his position at the head of that complex world. At first, when he rose from the long, deep sleep that followed his rescue and the surrender of the council, he did not recognize his surroundings. By an effort, he gained a clue in his mind, and all that had happened came back to him. At first, with a quality of insincerity, like a story heard, like something read out of a book. and even before his memories were clear, the exultation of his escape, the wonder of his prominence were back in his mind. He was the owner of the world, master of the earth. This new great age was in the completest sense his. He no longer hoped to discover his experiences a dream. He became anxious now to convince himself that they were real. An obsequious valet assisted him to dress under the direction of a dignified chief attendant, a little man whose face proclaimed him Japanese, albeit he spoke English like an Englishman. From the latter he learnt something of the state of affairs. Already the revolution was an accepted fact. Already business was being resumed throughout the city. Abroad, the downfall of the council had been received for the most part with delight. Nowhere was the council popular, and the 1,000 cities of Western America, after 200 years still jealous of New York, London, and the East, had risen almost unanimously 2 days before at the news of Graham's imprisonment. Paris was fighting within itself. The rest of the world hung in suspense. While he was breaking his fast, the sound of a telephone bell jetted from a corner, and his chief attendant calls his attention to the voice of Ostrog making polite inquiries. Graham interrupted his refreshment to reply. Very shortly, Lincoln arrived, and Graham at once expressed a strong desire to talk to people and to be shown more of the new life that was opening before him. Lincoln informed him that in 3 hours' time a representative gathering of officials and their wives would be held in the state apartments of the Wind Vane chief. Graham's desire to traverse the ways of the city was, however, at present impossible because of the enormous excitement of the people. It was, however, quite possible for him to take a bird's-eye view of the city from the crow's nest of the Wind Vane keeper. To this Graham was conducted by his attendant Lincoln. With a graceful compliment to the attendant, apologized for not accompanying them on account of the present pressure of administrative work. Higher even than the most gigantic wind-wheels hung this crow's nest, a clear 1,000 feet above the roofs, a little disc-shaped speck on a spear of metallic filigree, cable-stayed. To its summit Graham was drawn in a little wire-hung cradle. Halfway down the frail-seeming stem was a light gallery, about which hung a cluster of tubes. Minute they looked from above, rotating slowly on the ring of its outer rail. They were specula en rapport with the Wind Vane keeper's mirrors, in one of which Ostrog had shown him the coming of his rule. His Japanese attendant ascended before him, and they spent nearly an hour asking and answering questions. It was a day full of the promise and quality of spring. The touch of the wind warmed, the sky was an intense blue, and the vast expanse of London shone, dazzling under the morning sun. The air was clear of smoke and haze, sweet as the air of a mountain glen. Save for the irregular ovals of ruins about the House of Council and the black flag of the surrender that flew there, the mighty city seen from above showed few signs of the swift revolution that had, to his imagination, in one night and one day, changed the destinies of the world. A multitude of people still swarmed over these ruins, and the huge open-work stagings in the distance from which started in times of peace the service of aeroplanes to the great cities of Europe and America were also black with the victors. Across a narrow way of planking, raised on trestles that crossed the ruins, a crowd of workmen were busy restoring the connection between the cables and wires of the council house and the rest of the city, preparatory to the transfer thither of Ostrog's headquarters from the Wind Vane buildings. For the rest, the luminous expanse was undisturbed. So vast was its serenity in comparison with the areas of disturbance that presently Graham, looking beyond them, could almost forget the thousands of men lying out of sight in the artificial glare within the quasi-subterranean labyrinth, dead or dying of the overnight wounds. Forget the improvised wards with the hosts of surgeons, nurses, and bearers feverishly busy. Forget, indeed, all the wonder, consternation, and novelty under the electric lights. Down there in the hidden ways of the ant-hill, he knew that the revolution triumphed, that black everywhere carried the day, black favors, black banners, black festoons across the streets. And out here, under the fresh sunlight, beyond the crater of the fight, as if nothing had happened to the earth, the forest of wind vanes that had grown from one or two while the council had ruled roared peacefully upon their incessant duty. Far away, spiked, jagged, and indented by the wind vanes, the Surrey hills rose blue and faint. To the north and nearer, the sharp contours of Highgate and Muswell Hill were similarly jagged, and all over the countryside he knew, on every crest and hill, where once the hedges had interlaced, and cottages, churches, inns, and farmhouses had nestled among their trees, windwheels similar to those he saw, and bearing like them vast advertisements, gaunt and distinctive symbols of the new age, cast their whirling shadows and stored incessantly the energy that flowed away incessantly through all the arteries of the city. And underneath these wandered the countless flocks and herds of the British Food Trust, his property, with their lonely guards and keepers. Not a familiar outline anywhere broke the cluster of gigantic shapes below. St. Paul's, he knew, survived, and many of the old buildings in Westminster, embedded out of sight, arched over, and covered in among the giant growths of this great age. The Thames, too, made no fall and gleam of silver to break the wilderness of the city. The thirsty water mains drank up every drop of its waters before they reached the walls. Its bed and estuary, scoured and sunken, was now a canal of sea-water, and a race of grimy bargemen brought the heavy materials of trade from the pool thereby beneath the very feet of the workers. Faint and dim in the eastward, between earth and sky, hung the clustering masts of the colossal shipping in the pool. For all the heavy traffic, for which there was no need of haste, came in gigantic sailing ships from the ends of the earth, and the heavy goods, for which there was urgency, in mechanical ships of a smaller, swifter sort. And to the south, over the hills, came vast aqueducts with sea-water for the sewers, and in 3 separate directions ran pallid lines, the road stippled with moving grey specks. On the first occasion that offered, he was determined to go out and see these roads. They would come after the flying ship he was presently to try. His attendant officer described them as a pair of gently curving surfaces 100 yards wide, each one for the traffic going in one direction, and made of a substance called Eadhamite, an artificial substance, so far as he could gather, resembling toughened glass. Along this shot a strange traffic of narrow rubber-shod vehicles, great single wheels, 2- and 4-wheeled vehicles, sweeping along at velocities of from 1 to 6 miles a minute. Railroads had vanished. A few embankments remained, as rust-crowned trenches here and there. Some few formed the cores of Eadhamite ways. Among the first things to strike his attention had been the great fleets of advertisement balloons and kites that receded in irregular vistas northward and southward along the lines of the aeroplane journeys. No great aeroplanes were to be seen. Their passages had ceased, and only one little seeming monoplane circled high in the blue distance above the Surrey hills, an unimpressive soaring speck. A thing Graham had already learnt, and which he found very hard to imagine, was that nearly all the towns in the country and almost all the villages had disappeared. Here and there only, he understood, some gigantic hotel-like edifice stood amid square miles of some single cultivation and preserved the name of a town, as at Bournemouth, Wareham, or Swanage. Yet the officer had speedily convinced him how inevitable such a change had been. The old order had dotted the countryside with farmhouses, and every 2 or 3 miles was the ruling landlord's estate, and the place of the inn and cobbler, the grocery shop and the church, the village. Every 8 miles or so was the country town, where lawyer, corn merchant, wood stapler, saddler, veterinary surgeon, doctor, draper, milliner, and so forth lived. Every 8 miles, simply because that 8-mile marketing journey, 4 there and back, was as much as was comfortable for the farmer. But directly the railways came into play, and after them the light railways, and all the swift new motor cars that had replaced wagons and horses, and so soon as the high roads began to be made of wood and rubber and Eadhamite and all sorts of elastic durable substances, the necessity for having such frequent market towns disappeared. And the big towns grew. They drew the worker with the gravitational force of seemingly endless work, the employer with their suggestion of an infinite ocean of labor. As the standard of comfort rose, as the complexity of the mechanism of living increased, life in the country had become more and more costly, or narrow and impossible. The disappearance of vicar and squire, the extinction of the general practitioner by the city specialist, had robbed the village of its last touch of culture. After telephone, kinematograph, and phonograph had replaced newspaper, book, schoolmaster, and letter, to live outside the range of the electric cables was to live an isolated savage. In the country there were neither means of being clothed nor fed, according to the refined conceptions of the time, no efficient doctors for an emergency, no company, and no pursuits. Moreover, mechanical appliances in agriculture made one engineer the equivalent of 30 laborers. So, inverting the condition of the city clerk in the days when London was scarce inhabitable because of the coaly foulness of its airs, the laborers now came to the city and its life and delights at night, to leave it again in the morning. The city had swallowed up humanity. Man had entered upon a new stage in his development. First had come the nomad, the hunter. Then had followed the agriculturalist of the agricultural state, whose towns and cities and ports were but the headquarters and markets of the countryside. And now, logical consequence of an epoch of invention was this huge new aggregation of men. Such things as these, simple statements of fact though they were to contemporary men, strained Graham's imagination to picture, and when he glanced over beyond there at the strange things that existed on the continent, it failed him altogether. He had a vision of city beyond city, cities on great plains, cities beside great rivers, vast cities along the sea margin, cities girdled by snowy mountains. Over a great part of the earth the English tongue was spoken. Taken together with its Spanish-American and Hindu and Negro and Pidgin dialects, it was the everyday language of 2/3 of humanity. On the continent, save as remote and curious survivals, 3 other languages alone held sway. German, which reached to Antioch and Genoa, and jostled Spanish-English at Cadiz, a Gallicized Russian, which met the Indian English in Persia and Kurdistan, and the Pidgin English in Pekin, and French, still clear and brilliant, the language of lucidity, which shared the Mediterranean with the Indian English and German, and reached through a Negro dialect to the Congo. And everywhere now through the city-set earth, save in the administered black belt territories of the tropics, the same cosmopolitan social organization prevailed, and everywhere from pole to equator his property and his responsibilities extended. The whole world was civilized, the whole world dwelt in cities, the whole world was his property. Out of the dim southwest, glittering and strange, voluptuous and in some ways terrible, shone those pleasure cities of which the kinematograph, phonograph, and the old man in the street had spoken. Strange places, reminiscent of the legendary Sybaris, cities of art and beauty, mercenary art and mercenary beauty, sterile, wonderful cities of motion and music, whither repaired all who profited by the fierce, inglorious economic struggle that went on in the glaring labyrinth below. Fierce he knew it was. How fierce he could judge from the fact that these latter-day people referred back to the England of the 19th century as the figure of an idyllic, easy-going life. He turned his eyes to the scene immediately before him again, trying to conceive the big factories of that intricate maze. Thus concludes Chapter 14 of The Sleeper Awakes by H.G. Wells, read by Nat Johnson, Rockport, Massachusetts.
Chapter 15. Prominent People. The state apartments of the Wind Vane Keeper would have astonished Graham had he entered them fresh from his 19th century life, but already he was growing accustomed to the scale of the new time. He came out through one of the now familiar sliding panels upon a plateau of landing at the head of a flight of very broad and gentle steps, with men and women far more brilliantly dressed than any he had hitherto seen, ascending and descending. From this position he looked down upon a vista of subtle and varied ornament in lustreless white and mauve and purple, spanned by bridges that seemed wrought of porcelain and filigree, and terminating far off in a cloudy mystery of perforated screens. Glancing upward, he saw tier above tier of ascending galleries, with faces looking down upon him. The air was full of the babble of innumerable voices, and of a music that descended from above, a gay and exhilarating music whose source he did not discover. The central aisle was thick with people, but by no means uncomfortably crowded. Altogether that assembly must have numbered many thousands. They were brilliantly, even fantastically dressed, the men as fancifully as the women, for the sobering influence of the Puritan conception of dignity upon masculine dress had long since passed away. The hair of the men, too, though it was rarely worn long, was commonly curled in a manner that suggested the barber, and baldness had vanished from the earth. Frizzy, straight-cut masses that would have charmed Rossetti abounded, and one gentleman, who was pointed out to Graham under the mysterious title of an amorist, wore his hair in 2 becoming plaits, à la Marguerite. The pigtail was in evidence. It would seem that citizens of Chinese extraction were no longer ashamed of their race. There was little uniformity of fashion apparent in the forms of clothing worn. The more shapely men displayed their symmetry in trunk hose, and here were puffs and sashes, and there a cloak, and there a robe. The fashions of the days of Leo X were perhaps the prevailing influence, but the aesthetic conceptions of the Far East were also patent, masculine embonpoint, which in Victorian times would have been subjected to the buttoned perils, the ruthless exaggeration of tight-legged, tight-armed evening dress, now formed but the basis of a wealth of dignity and drooping folds. Graceful slenderness abounded also. To Graham, a typically stiff man from a typically stiff period, not only did these men seem altogether too graceful in person, but altogether too expressive in their vividly expressive faces. They gesticulated. They expressed surprise, interest, amusement. Above all, they expressed the emotions excited in their minds by the ladies about them with astonishing frankness. Even at the first glance it was evident that women were in a great majority. The ladies in the company of these gentlemen displayed in dress, bearing, and manner alike less emphasis and more intricacy. Some affected a classical simplicity of robing and subtlety of fold, after the fashion of the first French Empire, and flashed conquering arms and shoulders as Graham passed. Others had closely fitting dresses without seam or belt at the waist, sometimes with long folds falling from their shoulders. The delightful confidences of evening dress had not been diminished by the passage of 2 centuries. Everyone's movements seemed graceful. Graham remarked to Lincoln that he saw men as Raphael's cartoons walking, and Lincoln told him that the attainment of an appropriate set of gestures was part of every rich person's education. The master's entry was greeted with a sort of tittering applause, but these people showed their distinguished manners by not crowding upon him, nor annoying him by any persistent scrutiny, as he descended the steps towards the floor of the aisle. He had already learnt from Lincoln that these were the leaders of existing London society. Almost every person there that night was either a powerful official or the immediate connection of a powerful official. Many had returned from the European pleasure cities expressly to welcome him. The aeronautic authorities, whose defection had played a part in the overthrow of the council only second to Graham's, were very prominent, and so, too, was the wind vane control. Amongst others there were several of the more prominent officers of the food department. The controller of the European piggeries had a particularly melancholy and interesting countenance, and a daintily cynical manner. A bishop in full canonicals passed athwart Graham's vision, conversing with a gentleman dressed exactly like the traditional Chaucer, including even the laurel wreath. "Who is that?" he asked almost involuntarily. "The Bishop of London," said Lincoln. "No, the other, I mean." "Poet laureate." "You still?" "He doesn't make poetry, of course. He's a cousin of Wotton, one of the councillors, but he's one of the Red Rose Loyalists, a delightful club, and they keep up the tradition of these things. Asano told me there was a king." "The king doesn't belong. They had to expel him. It's the Stuart blood, I suppose, but really—" "Too much?" "Far too much." Graham did not quite follow all this, but it seemed part of the general inversion of the new age. He bowed condescendingly to his first introduction. It was evident that subtle distinctions of class prevailed even in this assembly, that only to a small proportion of the guests, to an inner group, did Lincoln consider it appropriate to introduce him. The first introduction was the master aeronaut, a man whose sun-tanned face contrasted oddly with the delicate complexions about him. Just at present, his critical defection from the council made him a very important person indeed. His manner contrasted very favourably, according to Graham's ideas, with the general bearing. He offered a few commonplace remarks, assurances of loyalty, and frank inquiries about the master's health. His manner was breezy, his accent lacked the easy staccato of latter-day English. He made it admirably clear to Graham that he was a bluff aerial dog, he used that phrase, that there was no nonsense about him, that he was a thoroughly manly fellow and old-fashioned at that he didn't profess to know much, and that what he did know was not worth knowing. He made a curt bow, ostentatiously free from obsequiousness, and passed. "I'm glad to see that type endures," said Graham. "Photographs and kinematographs," said Lincoln a little spitefully. "He is studied from the life." Graham glanced at the burly form again. It was oddly reminiscent. "As a matter of fact, we bought him," said Lincoln. "Partly. And partly he was afraid of Ostrog. Everything rested with him." He turned sharply to introduce the Surveyor General of the public schools. This person was a willowy figure in a blue-grey academic gown. He beamed down upon Graham through pince-nez of a Victorian pattern, and illustrated his remarks by gestures of a beautifully manicured hand. Graham was immediately interested in this gentleman's functions, and asked him a number of singularly direct questions. The Surveyor General seemed quietly amused at the master's fundamental bluntness. He was a little vague as to the monopoly of education his company possessed. It was done by contract with the syndicate that ran the numerous London municipalities, but he waxed enthusiastic over educational progress since the Victorian times. "We have conquered cram," he said, "completely conquered cram. There is not an examination left in the world. Aren't you glad?" "How do you get the work done?" asked Graham. "We make it attractive as possible, and if it does not attract then, we let it go. We cover an immense field." He proceeded to details, and they had a lengthy conversation. Graham learnt that university extension still existed in a modified form. "There is a certain type of girl, for instance," said the Surveyor General, dilating with a sense of his usefulness, "with a perfect passion for severe studies. When they are not too difficult, you know. We cater for them by the thousand. At this moment," he said with a Napoleonic touch, "nearly 500 phonographs are lecturing in different parts of London on the influence exercised by Plato and Swift on the love affairs of Shelley, Hazlitt, and Burns. And afterwards they write essays on the lectures, and the names in order of merit are put in conspicuous places. You see how your little germ has grown? The illiterate middle class of your days has quite passed away." "About the public elementary schools," said Graham, "do you control them?" The Surveyor General did. Entirely. Now Graham, in his later democratic days, had taken a keen interest in these, and his questioning quickened. Certain casual phrases that had fallen from the old man with whom he had talked in the darkness recurred to him. The Surveyor General, in effect, endorsed the old man's words. "We try and make the elementary schools very pleasant for the little children. They will have to work so soon. Just a few simple principles. Obedience, industry. You teach them very little?" "Why should we? It only leads to trouble and discontent. We amuse them. Even as it is, there are troubles, agitations. Where the labourers get the ideas, one cannot tell. They tell one another. There are socialistic dreams, anarchy even. Agitators will get to work among them. I have always taken it, that my foremost duty is to fight against popular discontent. Why should people be made unhappy?" "I wonder," said Graham thoughtfully. "But there are a great many things I want to know." Lincoln, who had stood watching Graham's face throughout the conversation, intervened. "There are others," he said in an undertone. The Surveyor General of Schools gesticulated himself away. "Perhaps," said Lincoln, intercepting a casual glance, "you would like to know some of these ladies?" The daughter of the manager of the piggeries was a particularly charming little person with red hair and animated blue eyes. Lincoln left him a while to converse with her, and she displayed herself as quite an enthusiast for the "dear old days," as she called them, that had seen the beginning of his trance. As she talked she smiled, and her eyes smiled in a manner that demanded reciprocity. "I have tried," she said, "countless times, to imagine those old romantic days, and to you they are memories. How strange and crowded the world must seem to you. I have seen photographs and pictures of the past, and little isolated houses built of bricks made out of burnt mud and all black with soot from your fires, the railway bridges, the simple advertisements, the solemn, savage, puritanical men in strange black coats, and those tall hats of theirs, iron railway trains on iron bridges overhead, horses and cattle, and even dogs running half wild about the streets. And suddenly you have come into this." "Into this," said Graham. "Out of your life, out of all that was familiar." "The old life was not a happy one," said Graham. "I do not regret that." She looked at him quickly. There was a brief pause. She sighed encouragingly. "No?" "No," said Graham. "It was a little life, and unmeaning. But this, we thought the world complex and crowded and civilized enough. Yet I see, although in this world I am barely 4 days old, looking back on my own time, that it was a queer, barbaric time. The mere beginning of this new order. The mere beginning of this new order. You will find it hard to understand how little I know." "You may ask me what you like," she said, smiling at him. "Then tell me who these people are. I'm still very much in the dark about them. It's puzzling. Are there any generals?" "Men in hats and feathers?" "Of course not. No. I suppose they are the men who control the great public businesses." "Who is that distinguished-looking man?" "That? He's a most important officer. That is Morden. He is managing director of the antibilious pill department. I have heard that his workers sometimes turn out a myriad pills a day in the 24 hours. Fancy, a myriad. A myriad. No wonder he looks proud," said Graham. "Pills. What a wonderful time it is. That man in purple? He is not quite one of the inner circle, you know. But we like him. He is really clever and very amusing. He is one of the heads of the medical faculty of our London University. All medical men, you know, wear that purple. But of course people who are paid by fees for doing something—" She smiled away the social pretensions of all such people. "Are any of your great artists or authors here?" "Not authors. They are mostly such queer people, and so preoccupied about themselves, and they quarrel so dreadfully. They will fight, some of them, for precedence on staircases. Dreadful, isn't it? But I think Wraysbury, the fashionable capillotomist, is here. From Capri." "Capillotomist," said Graham. "Ah, I remember. An artist. Why not?" "We have to cultivate him," she said apologetically. "Our heads are in his hands." She smiled. Graham hesitated at the invited compliment, but his glance was expressive. "Have the arts grown with the rest of civilized things?" he said. "Who are your great painters?" She looked at him doubtfully, then laughed. "For a moment," she said, "I thought you meant—" She laughed again. "You mean, of course, those good men you used to think so much of because they could cover great spaces of canvas with oil colors? great oblongs, and people used to put the things in gilt frames and hang them up in rows in their square rooms. We haven't any. People grew tired of that sort of thing. But what did you think I meant?" She put a finger significantly on a cheek whose glow was above suspicion, and smiled and looked very arch and pretty and inviting. "And here," and she indicated her eyelid. Graham had an adventurous moment. Then a grotesque memory of a picture he had somewhere seen of Uncle Toby and the widow flashed across his mind. An archaic shame came upon him. He became acutely aware that he was visible to a great number of interested people. "I see," he remarked inadequately. He turned awkwardly away from her fascinating facility. He looked about him to meet a number of eyes that immediately occupied themselves with other things. Possibly he colored a little. "Who is that talking with the lady in saffron?" he said, avoiding her eyes. The person in question, he learnt, was one of the great organizers of the American theaters, just fresh from a gigantic production at Mexico. His face reminded Graham of a bust of Caligula. Another striking-looking man was the Black Labour Master. The phrase at the time made no deep impression, but afterwards it recurred. The Black Labour Master? The little lady, in no degree embarrassed, pointed out to him a charming little woman as one of the subsidiary wives of the Anglican Bishop of London. She added encomiums on the episcopal courage. Hitherto there had been a rule of clerical monogamy, neither a natural nor an expedient condition of things. Why should a natural development of the affections be dwarfed and restricted because a man is a priest? "And by the by," she added, "are you an Anglican?" Graham was on the verge of hesitating inquiries about the status of a subsidiary wife, apparently a euphemistic phrase, when Lincoln's return broke off this very suggestive and interesting conversation. They crossed the aisle to where a tall man in crimson and two charming persons in Burmese costume, as it seemed to him, awaited him diffidently. From their civilities he passed to other presentations. In a little while his multitudinous impressions began to organize themselves into a general effect. At first the glitter of the gathering had raised all the democrat in Graham. He had felt hostile and satirical. But it is not in human nature to resist an atmosphere of courteous regard. Soon the music, the light, the play of colors, the shining arms and shoulders about him, the touch of hands, the transient interest of smiling faces, the frothing sound of skillfully modulated voices, the atmosphere of compliment, interest, and respect, had woven together into a fabric of indisputable pleasure. Graham for a time forgot his spacious resolutions. He gave way insensibly to the intoxication of the position that was conceded him. His manner became more convincingly regal. His feet walked assuredly. The black robe fell with a bolder fold, and pride ennobled his voice. After all, this was a brilliant, interesting world. He looked up and saw passing across a bridge of porcelain, and looking down upon him, a face that was almost immediately hidden, the face of the girl he had seen overnight in the little room beyond the theatre after his escape from the council. And she was watching him. For the moment he did not remember when he had seen her, and then came a vague memory of the stirring emotions of their first encounter. But the dancing web of melody about him kept the air of that great marching song from his memory. The lady to whom he talked repeated her remark, and Graham recalled himself to the quasi-regal flirtation upon which he was engaged. Yet, unaccountably, a vague restlessness, a feeling that grew to dissatisfaction, came into his mind. He was troubled as if by some half-forgotten duty, by the sense of things important slipping from him amidst this light and brilliance. The attraction that these ladies who crowded about him were beginning to exercise ceased. He no longer gave vague and clumsy responses to the subtly amorous advances that he was now assured were being made to him, and his eyes wandered for another sight of the girl of the first revolt. Where precisely had he seen her? Graham was in one of the upper galleries in conversation with a bright-eyed lady on the subject of Eadhamite. The subject was his choice and not hers. He had interrupted her warm assurance of personal devotion with a matter-of-fact inquiry. He found her, as he had already found several other latter-day women that night, less well-informed than charming. Suddenly, struggling against the eddying drift of nearer melody, the song of the revolt, the great song he had heard in the hall, hoarse and massive, came beating down to him. Ah, now he remembered. He glanced up, startled, and perceived above him an Audiobook through which this song had come, and beyond, the upper courses of cable, the blue haze, and the pendant fabric of the lights of the public ways. He heard the song break into a tumult of voices and cease. He perceived quite clearly the drone and tumult of the moving platforms, and a murmur of many people. He had a vague persuasion that he could not account for, a sort of instinctive feeling that outside in the ways a huge crowd must be watching this place in which their master amused himself. Though the song had stopped so abruptly, though the special music of this gathering reasserted itself, the motif of the marching song, once it had begun, lingered in his mind. The bright-eyed lady was still struggling with the mysteries of Eadhamite when he perceived the girl he had seen in the theatre again. She was coming now along the gallery towards him. He saw her first before she saw him. She was dressed in a faintly luminous grey. Her dark hair about her brows was like a cloud, and as he saw her the cold light from the circular opening into the ways fell upon her downcast face. The lady in trouble about the Eadhamite saw the change in his expression, and grasped her opportunity to escape. "Would you care to know that girl, sire?" she asked boldly. "She is Helen Wotton, a niece of the Ostrogs. She knows a great many serious things. She is one of the most serious persons alive. I am sure you will like her." In another moment Graham was talking to the girl, and the bright-eyed lady had fluttered away. "I remember you quite well," said Graham. "You were in that little room, when all the people were singing and beating time with their feet, before I walked across the hall." Her momentary embarrassment passed. She looked up at him, and her face was steady. "It was wonderful," she said, hesitated, and spoke with a sudden effort. "All those people would have died for you, sire. Countless people did die for you that night." Her face glowed. She glanced swiftly aside to see that no other heard her words. Lincoln appeared some way off along the gallery, making his way through the press towards them. She saw him and turned to Graham strangely eager with a swift change to confidence and intimacy. "Sire," she said quickly, "I cannot tell you now and here, but the common people are very unhappy. They are oppressed. They are misgoverned. Do not forget the people who faced death, death that you might live." "I know nothing," began Graham. "I cannot tell you now." Lincoln's face appeared close to them. He bowed an apology to the girl. "You find the New World amusing, sire?" said Lincoln with smiling deference, and indicating the space and splendor of the gathering by one comprehensive gesture. "At any rate, you find it changed." "Yes," said Graham, "changed, and yet, after all, not so greatly changed." "Wait till you are in the air," said Lincoln. "The wind has fallen. Even now an aeroplane awaits you." The girl's attitude awaited dismissal. Graham glanced at her face, was on the verge of a question, found a warning in her expression, bowed to her, and turned to accompany Lincoln. End of Chapter 15. Chapter 16. The Monoplane. The flying stages of London were collected together in an irregular crescent on the southern side of the river. They formed 3 groups of 2 each, and retained the names of ancient suburban hills or villages. They were named in order: Roehampton, Wimbledon Park, Streatham, Norwood, Blackheath, and Shooter's Hill. They were uniform structures rising high above the general roof surfaces. Each was about 4,000 yards long and 1,000 broad, and constructed of the compound of aluminum and iron that had replaced iron in architecture. Their higher tiers formed an openwork of girders through which lifts and staircases ascended. The upper surface was a uniform expanse with portions, the starting carriers, that could be raised and were then able to run on very slightly inclined rails to the end of the fabric. Graham went to the flying stages by the public ways. He was accompanied by Asano, his Japanese attendant. Lincoln was called away by Ostrog, who was busy with his administrative concerns. A strong guard of Wind Vane police awaited the master outside the Wind Vane offices, and they cleared a space for him on the upper moving platform. His passage to the flying stages was unexpected. Nevertheless, a considerable crowd gathered and followed him to his destination. As he went along, he could hear the people shouting his name, and saw numberless men and women and children in blue come swarming up the staircases in the central path, gesticulating and shouting. He could not hear what they shouted. He was struck again by the evident existence of a vulgar dialect among the poor of the city. When at last he descended, his guards were immediately surrounded by a dense, excited crowd. Afterwards it occurred to him that some had attempted to reach him with petitions. His guards cleared a passage for him with difficulty. He found a monoplane in charge of an aeronaut awaiting him on the westward stage. Seen close, this mechanism was no longer small. As it lay on its launching carrier upon the wide expanse of the flying stage, its aluminum body skeleton was as big as the hull of a 20-ton yacht. Its lateral supporting sails braced and stayed with metal nerves almost like the nerves of a bee's wing, and made of some sort of glassy artificial membrane, cast their shadow over many hundreds of square yards. The chairs for the engineer and his passenger hung free to swing by a complex tackle within the protecting ribs of the frame and well abaft the middle. The passenger's chair was protected by a wind guard and guarded about with metallic rods carrying air cushions. It could, if desired, be completely closed in, but Graham was anxious for novel experiences, and desired that it should be left open. The aeronaut sat behind a glass that sheltered his face. The passenger could secure himself firmly in his seat, and this was almost unavoidable on landing, or he could move along by means of a little rail and rod to a locker at the stem of the machine, where his personal luggage, his wraps and restoratives were placed, and which also, with the seats, served as a make-weight to the parts of the central engine that projected to the propeller at the stern. The flying stage about him was empty, save for Asano and their suite of attendants. Directed by the aeronaut, he placed himself in his seat. Asano stepped through the bars of the hull, and stood below on the stage waving his hand. He seemed to slide along the stage to the right and vanish. The engine was humming loudly, the propeller spinning, and for a second the stage and the buildings beyond were gliding swiftly and horizontally past Graham's eye. Then these things seemed to tilt up abruptly. He gripped the little rods on either side of him instinctively. He felt himself moving upward, heard the air whistle over the top of the windscreen. The propeller screw moved with powerful rhythmic impulses. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, which the engineer controlled very delicately. The machine began a quivering vibration that continued throughout the flight, and the roof areas seemed running away to starboard very quickly and growing rapidly smaller. He looked from the face of the engineer through the ribs of the machine. Looking sideways, there was nothing very startling in what he saw. A rapid funicular railway might have given the same sensations. He recognized the council house and the Highgate Ridge. And then he looked straight down between his feet. For a moment, physical terror possessed him, a passionate sense of insecurity. He held tight. For a second or so he could not lift his eyes. Some 100 feet or more sheer below him was one of the big wind vanes of southwest London, and beyond it the southernmost flying stage crowded with little black dots. These things seemed to be falling away from him. For a second he had an impulse to pursue the earth. He set his teeth, he lifted his eyes by a muscular effort, and the moment of panic passed. He remained for a space with his teeth set hard, his eyes staring into the sky. Throb, 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 beat, went the engine. Throb, 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 beat. He grabbed his bars tightly, glanced at the aeronaut, and saw a smile upon his sun-tanned face. He smiled in return, perhaps a little artificially. "A little strange at first," he shouted before he recalled his dignity. But he dared not look down again for some time. He stared over the aeronaut's head to where a rim of vague blue horizon crept up the sky. For a little while he could not banish the thought of possible accidents from his mind. Throb, 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 beat. Suppose some trivial screw went wrong in that supporting engine. Suppose... He made a grim effort to dismiss all such suppositions. After a while they did at least abandon the foreground of his thoughts. And up he went steadily, higher and higher into the clear air. Once the mental shock of moving unsupported through the air was over, his sensations ceased to be unpleasant, became very speedily pleasurable. He had been warned of air sickness, but he found the pulsating movement of the monoplane as it drove up the faint southwest breeze was very little in excess of the pitching of a boat head-on to broad rollers in a moderate gale, and he was constitutionally a good sailor. And the keenness of the more rarefied air into which they ascended produced a sense of lightness and exhilaration. He looked up and saw the blue sky above fretted with cirrus clouds. His eye came cautiously down through the ribs and bars to a shining flight of white birds that hung in the lower sky. For a space he watched these. Then, going lower and less apprehensively, he saw the slender figure of the wind vane keeper's crow's nest shining golden in the sunlight and growing smaller every moment. As his eye fell with more confidence now, there came a blue line of hills, and then London, already to leeward, an intricate space of roofing. Its near edge came sharp and clear, and banished his last apprehensions in a shock of surprise. For the boundary of London was like a wall, like a cliff, a steep fall of 300 or 400 feet, a frontage broken only by terraces here and there, a complex decorative facade. The gradual passage of town into country through an extensive sponge of suburbs, which was so characteristic a feature of the great cities of the 19th century, existed no longer. Nothing remained of it here but a waste of ruins, variegated and dense with thickets of the heterogeneous growths that had once adorned the gardens of the belt, interspersed along levelled brown patches of sown ground and verdant stretches of winter greens. The latter even spread among the vestiges of houses. But for the most part the reefs and skerries of ruins, the wreckage of suburban villas, stood among their streets and roads, queer islands amidst the levelled expanses of green and brown, abandoned indeed by the inhabitants years since, but too substantial, it seemed, to be cleared out of the way of the wholesale horticultural mechanisms of the time. The vegetation of this waste undulated and frothed amidst the countless cells of crumbling house walls, and broke along the foot of the city wall in a surf of bramble and holly and ivy and teasel and tall grasses. Here and there gaudy pleasure palaces towered amidst the puny remains of Victorian times, and cableways slanted to them from the city. That winter day they seemed deserted. Deserted, too, were the artificial gardens among the ruins. The city limits were indeed as sharply defined as in the ancient days when the gates were shut at nightfall, and the robber foemen prowled through the very walls. A huge semicircular throat poured out a vigorous traffic upon the Edomite Bath Road. So the first prospect of the world beyond the city flashed on Graham, and dwindled. And when at last he could look vertically downward again, he saw below him the vegetable fields of the Thames Valley, innumerable minute oblongs of ruddy brown, intersected by shining threads, the sewage ditches. His exhilaration increased rapidly, became a sort of intoxication. He found himself drawing deep breaths of air, laughing aloud, desiring to shout. After a time that desire became too strong for him, and he shouted. They curved about towards the south. They drove with a slight list to leeward, and with a slow alteration of movement, first a short, sharp ascent, and then a long downward glide that was very swift and pleasing. During these downward glides, the propeller was inactive altogether. These ascents gave Graham a glorious sense of successful effort. The descents through the rarefied air were beyond all experience. He wanted never to leave the upper air again. For a time he was intent upon the landscape that ran swiftly northward beneath him. Its minute, clear detail pleased him exceedingly. He was impressed by the ruin of the houses that had once dotted the country, by the vast treeless expanse of country from which all farms and villages had gone, save for crumbling ruins. He had known the thing was so, but seeing it so was an altogether different matter. He tried to make out familiar places within the hollow basin of the world below, but at first he could distinguish no data now that the Thames Valley was left behind. Soon, however, they were driving over a sharp chalk hill that he recognized as Guildford Hog's Back, because of the familiar outline of the gorge at its eastward end, and because of the ruins of the town that rose steeply on either lip of this gorge. And from that he made out other points, Leith Hill, the sandy wastes of Aldershot, and so forth. Save where the broad Edomite Portsmouth Road, thickly dotted with rushing shapes, followed the course of the old railway, the gorge of the way was choked with thickets. The whole expanse of the Downs escarpment, so far as the grey haze permitted him to see, was set with wind-wheels, to which the largest of the city was but a younger brother. They stirred with a stately motion before the south-west wind, and here and there were patches dotted with the sheep of the British Food Trust, and here and there a mounted shepherd made a spot of black. Then, rushing under the stern of the plane, came the Wealden Heights, the line of Hindhead, Pitch Hill, and Leith Hill, with a second row of wind-wheels that seemed striving to rob the downland whirlers of their share of breeze. The purple heather was speckled with yellow gorse, and on the further side a drove of black oxen stampeded before a couple of mounted men. Swiftly these swept behind, and dwindled and lost colour, and became scarce moving specks that were swallowed up in haze. And when these had vanished in the distance, Graham heard a pewit, wailing close at hand. He perceived he was now above the South Downs, and staring over his shoulder he saw the battlements of Portsmouth landing stage towering over the ridge of Portsdown Hill. In another moment there came into sight a spread of shipping like floating cities, the little white cliffs of the Needles dwarfed and sunlit, and the grey and glittering waters of the narrow sea. They seemed to leap the Solent in a moment, and in a few seconds the Isle of Wight was running past, and then beneath him spread a wider and wider extent of sea, here purple with the shadow of a cloud, here grey, here a burnished mirror, and here a spread of cloudy greenish blue. The Isle of Wight grew smaller and smaller. In a few more minutes a strip of grey haze detached itself from other strips that were clouds, descended out of the sky and became a coastline, sunlit and pleasant, the coast of northern France. It rose, it took colour, became definite and detailed, and the counterpart of the downland of England was speeding by below. In a little time, as it seemed, Paris came above the horizon, and hung there for a space, and sank out of sight again as the monoplane circled about to the north. But he perceived the Eiffel Tower still standing, and beside it a huge dome surmounted by a pinpoint colossus. And he perceived, too, though he did not understand it at the time, a slanting drift of smoke. The aeronaut said something about trouble in the underways that Graham did not heed, but he marked the minarets and towers and slender masses that streamed skyward above the city wind vanes, and knew that in the matter of grace at least, Paris still kept in front of her larger rival. And even as he looked, a pale blue shape ascended very swiftly from the city, like a dead leaf driving up before a gale. It curved round and soared towards them, growing rapidly larger and larger. The aeronaut was saying something. "What?" said Graham, loath to take his eyes from this. "London aeroplane, sire!" bawled the aeronaut, pointing. They rose and curved about northward as it drew nearer. Nearer it came, and nearer, larger and larger. The throb, throb, throb beat of the monoplane's flight, that had seemed so potent and so swift, suddenly appeared slow by comparison with this tremendous rush. How great the monster seemed! How swift and steady! It passed quite closely beneath them, driving along silently, a vast spread of wire-netted translucent wings, a thing alive. Graham had a momentary glimpse of the rows and rows of wrapped-up passengers, slung in their little cradles behind windscreens, of a white-clothed engineer crawling against the gale along a ladderway, of spouting engines beating together, of the whirling wind-screw, and of a wide waste of wing. He exulted in the sight, and in an instant the thing had passed. It rose slightly, and their own little wings swayed in the rush of its flight. It fell and grew smaller. Scarcely had they moved, as it seemed, before it was again only a flat blue thing that dwindled in the sky. This was the aeroplane that went to and fro between London and Paris. In fair weather and in peaceful times, it came and went 4 times a day. They beat across the Channel, slowly as it seemed now to Graham's enlarged ideas, and Beachy Head rose greyly to the left of them. "Land!" called the aeronaut, his voice small against the whistling of the air over the windscreen. "Not yet," bawled Graham, laughing. "Not land yet. I want to learn more of this machine." "I meant," said the aeronaut, "I want to learn more of this machine," repeated Graham. "I'm coming to you," he said, and had flung himself free of his chair and taken a step along the guarded rail between them. He stopped for a moment, and his colour changed, and his hands tightened. Another step, and he was clinging close to the aeronaut. He felt a weight on his shoulder, the pressure of the air. His hat was a whirling speck behind. The wind came in gusts over his windscreen and blew his hair in streamers past his cheek. The aeronaut made some hasty adjustments for the shifting of the centres of gravity and pressure. "I want to have these things explained," said Graham. "What do you do when you move that engine forward?" The aeronaut hesitated. Then he answered, "They are complex, sire." "I don't mind," shouted Graham. "I don't mind." There was a moment's pause. "Aeronautics is the secret, the privilege." "I know, but I'm the master, and I mean to know." He laughed, full of this novel realization of power that was his gift from the upper air. The monoplane curved about, and the keen, fresh wind cut across Graham's face, and his garment lugged at his body as the stem pointed round to the west. The two men looked into each other's eyes. "Sire, there are rules." "Not where I am concerned," said Graham. "You seem to forget." The aeronaut scrutinized his face. "No," he said, "I do not forget, sire, but in all the earth, no man who's a sworn aeronaut has ever a chance. They come as passengers. I have heard something of the sort, but I'm not going to argue these points. Do you know why I have slept 200 years? To fly!" "Sire," said the aeronaut. "The rules, if I break the rules—" Graham waved the penalties aside. "Then, if you will watch me—" "No," said Graham, swaying and gripping tight as the machine lifted its nose again for an ascent. "That's not my game. I want to do it myself. Do it myself if I smash for it. No, I will. See, I'm going to clamber by this, to come and share your seat. Steady! I mean to fly of my own accord if I smash at the end of it. I will have something to pay for my sleep. Of all other things, in my past it was my dream to fly. Now, keep your balance. A dozen spies are watching me, sire." Graham's temper was at an end. Perhaps he chose it should be. He swore. He swung himself round the intervening mass of levers and the monoplane swayed. "Am I master of the earth," he said, "or is it your society? Now, take your hands off those levers and hold my wrists. Yes, so. And now, how do we turn her nose down to the glide?" "Sire," said the aeronaut. "What is it?" "You will protect me?" "Lord, yes, if I have to burn London. Now." And with that promise Graham bought his first lesson in aerial navigation. "It's clearly to your advantage, this journey," he said with a loud laugh, for the air was like strong wine, "to teach me quickly and well. Do I pull this? Ah, so! Hullo! Back, sire, back! Back, right. 1, 2, 3, good God! Ah! Up she goes. But this is living!" And now the machine began to dance the strangest figures in the air. Now it would sweep round a spiral of scarcely 100 yards diameter, now rush up into the air and swoop down again, steeply, swiftly, falling like a hawk, to recover in a rushing loop that swept it high again. In one of these descents it seemed driving straight at the drifting park of balloons in the southeast, and only curved about and cleared them by a sudden recovery of dexterity. The extraordinary swiftness and the smoothness of the motion, the extraordinary effect of the rarefied air upon his constitution, threw Graham into a careless fury. But at last a queer incident came to sober him, to send him flying down once more to the crowded life below with all its dark, insoluble riddles. As he swooped came a tap and something flying past, and a drop like a drop of rain. Then, as he went down, he saw something like a white rag whirling down in his wake. "What was that?" he asked. "I did not see." The aeronaut glanced, and then clutched at the lever to recover, for they were sweeping down. When the monoplane was rising again, he drew a deep breath and replied, "That," and he indicated the white thing still fluttering down, "was a swan." "I never saw it," said Graham. The aeronaut made no answer, and Graham saw little drops upon his forehead. They drove horizontally while Graham clambered back to the passenger's place, out of the lash of the wind. And then came a swift rush down, with the wind screw whirling to check their fall, and the flying stage growing broad and dark before them. The sun, sinking over the chalk hills in the west, flew with them, and left the sky a blaze of gold. Soon men could be seen as little specks. He heard a noise coming up to meet him, a noise like the sound of waves upon a pebbly beach, and saw that the roofs of the flying stage were dense with his people rejoicing over his safe return. A black mass was crushed together under the stage, a darkness stippled with innumerable faces, and quivering with the minute oscillation of waved white handkerchiefs and waving hands. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17. 3 Days. Lincoln awaited Graham in an apartment beneath the flying stages. He seemed curious to learn all that had happened, pleased to hear of the extraordinary delight and interest which Graham took in flying. Graham was in a mood of enthusiasm. "I must learn to fly," he cried. "I must master that. I pity all poor souls who have died without this opportunity. The sweet, swift air. It is the most wonderful experience in the world." "You will find our new times full of wonderful experiences," said Lincoln. "I do not know what you will care to do now. We have music that may seem novel." "For the present," said Graham, "flying holds me. Let me learn more of that. Your aeronaut was saying there is some trades union objection to one's learning." "There is, I believe," said Lincoln. "But for you, if you would like to occupy yourself with that, we can make you a sworn aeronaut tomorrow." Graham expressed his wishes vividly and talked of his sensations for a while. "And as for affairs," he asked abruptly, "how are things going on?" Lincoln waved affairs aside. "Ostrog will tell you that tomorrow," he said. "Everything is settling down. The revolution accomplishes itself all over the world. Friction is inevitable here and there, of course, but your rule is assured. You may rest secure with things in Ostrog's hands." "Would it be possible for me to be made a sworn aeronaut, as you call it, forthwith, before I sleep?" said Graham, pacing. "Then I could be at it the very first thing tomorrow again." "It would be possible," said Lincoln thoughtfully. "Quite possible. Indeed, it shall be done." He laughed. "I came prepared to suggest amusements, but you have found one for yourself. I will telephone to the aeronautical offices from here, and we will return to your apartments in the wind vane control. By the time you have dined, the aeronauts will be able to come. You don't think that after you have dined you might prefer—" He paused. "Yes," said Graham. "We had prepared a show of dancers. They have been brought from the Capri Theater." "I hate ballets," said Graham shortly. "Always did. That's not what I want to see. We had dancers in the old days. For the matter of that, they had them in ancient Egypt. But flying—" "True," said Lincoln, "though our dancers—" "They can afford to wait," said Graham. "They can afford to wait. I know, I'm not a Latin. There's questions I want to ask some expert about your machinery. I'm keen. I want no distractions." "You have the world to choose from," said Lincoln. "Whatever you want is yours." Asano appeared, and under the escort of a strong guard, they returned through the city streets to Graham's apartments. Far larger crowds had assembled to witness his return than his departure had gathered, and the shouts and cheering of these masses of people sometimes drowned Lincoln's answers to the endless questions Graham's aerial journey had suggested. At first, Graham had acknowledged the cheering and cries of the crowd by bows and gestures, but Lincoln warned him that such a recognition would be considered incorrect behavior. Graham, already a little wearied by rhythmic civilities, ignored his subjects for the remainder of his public progress. Directly they arrived at his apartments. Asano departed in search of kinematographic renderings of machinery in motion, and Lincoln dispatched Graham's commands for models of machines and small machines to illustrate the various mechanical advances of the last 2 centuries. The little group of appliances for telegraphic communication attracted the master so strongly that his delightfully prepared dinner, served by a number of charmingly dexterous girls, waited for a space. The habit of smoking had almost ceased from the face of the earth, but when he expressed a wish for that indulgence, enquiries were made, and some excellent cigars were discovered in Florida, and sent to him by pneumatic dispatch while the dinner was still in progress. Afterwards came the aeronauts, and a feast of ingenious wonders in the hands of a latter-day engineer. For the time, at any rate, The neat dexterity of counting and numbering machines, building machines, spinning engines, patent doorways, explosive motors, grain and water elevators, slaughterhouse machines, and harvesting appliances was more fascinating to Graham than any bayadere. "We were savages," was his refrain. "We were savages. We were in the Stone Age compared with this. And what else have you?" There came also practical psychologists, with some very interesting developments in the art of hypnotism. The names of Milne Bramwell, Fechner, Lebeau, William James, Myers, and Gurney, he found, bore a value now that would have astonished their contemporaries. Several practical applications of psychology were now in general use. It had largely superseded drugs, antiseptics, and anesthetics in medicine, was employed by almost all who had any need of mental concentration. A real enlargement of human faculty seemed to have been effected in this direction. The feats of calculating boys, the wonders, as Graham had been wont to regard them, of mesmerizers, were now within the range of anyone who could afford the services of a skilled hypnotist. Long ago, the old examination methods in education had been destroyed by these expedients. Instead of years of study, candidates had substituted a few weeks of trances, and during the trances, expert coaches had simply to repeat all the points necessary for adequate answering, adding a suggestion of the post-hypnotic recollection of these points. In process mathematics particularly, this aid had been of singular service, and it was now invariably invoked by such players of chess and games of manual dexterity as were still to be found. In fact, all operations conducted under finite rules, of a quasi-mechanical sort that is, were now systematically relieved from the wanderings of imagination and emotion, and brought to an unexampled pitch of accuracy. Little children of the laboring classes, so soon as they were of sufficient age to be hypnotized, were thus converted into beautifully punctual and trustworthy machine-minders, and released forthwith from the long thoughts of youth. Aeronautical pupils, who gave way to giddiness, could be relieved from their imaginary terrors. In every street were hypnotists ready to print permanent memories upon the mind. If anyone desired to remember a name, a series of numbers, a song, or a speech, it could be done by this method, and conversely, memories could be effaced, habits removed, and desires eradicated. A sort of psychic surgery was, in fact, in general use. Indignities, humbling experiences were thus forgotten. Widows would obliterate their previous husbands. Angry lovers released themselves from their slavery. To graft desires, however, was still impossible, and the facts of thought transference were yet unsystematized. The psychologists illustrated their expositions with some astounding experiments in mnemonics made through the agency of a troop of pale-faced children in blue. Graham, like most of the people of his former time, distrusted the hypnotist, or he might then and there have eased his mind of many painful preoccupations. But in spite of Lincoln's assurances, he held to the old theory that to be hypnotized was in some way the surrender of his personality, the abdication of his will. At the banquet of wonderful experiences that was beginning, he wanted very keenly to remain absolutely himself. The next day, and another day, and yet another day passed in such interests as these. Each day Graham spent many hours in the glorious entertainment of flying. On the third, he soared across Middle France, and within sight of the snow-clad Alps. These vigorous exercises gave him restful sleep. He recovered almost wholly from the spiritless anemia of his first awakening. And whenever he was not in the air and awake, Lincoln was assiduous in the cause of his amusement. All that was novel and curious in contemporary invention was brought to him, until at last his appetite for novelty was well nigh glutted. One might fill a dozen inconsecutive volumes with the strange things they exhibited. Each afternoon he held his court for an hour or so. He found his interest in his contemporaries becoming personal and intimate. At first, he had been alert chiefly for unfamiliarity and peculiarity. Any foppishness in their dress, any discordance with his preconceptions of nobility in their status and manners had jarred upon him. And it was remarkable to him how soon that strangeness and the faint hostility that arose from it disappeared. How soon he came to appreciate the true perspective of his position, and see the old Victorian days remote and quaint. He found himself particularly amused by the red-haired daughter of the manager of the European piggeries. On the second day after dinner he made the acquaintance of a latter-day dancing girl, and found her an astonishing artist. And after that, more hypnotic wonders. On the third day, Lincoln was moved to suggest that the master should repair to a pleasure city, but this Graham declined, nor would he accept the services of hypnotists in his aeronautical experiments. The link of locality held him to London. He found a delight in topographical identifications that he would have missed abroad. Here, or 100 feet below here, he could say, I used to eat my midday cutlets during my London University days. Under here was Waterloo, and the tiresome hunt for confusing trains. Often have I stood waiting down there, bag in hand, and stared up into the sky above the forest of signals, little thinking I should walk some day 100 yards in the air. And now, in that very sky that was once a gray smoke canopy, I circle in a monoplane. During those 3 days, Graham was so occupied with these distractions that the vast political movements in progress outside his quarters had but a small share of his attention. Those about him told him little. Daily came Ostrog, the boss, his grand vizier, his mayor of the palace, to report in vague terms the steady establishment of his rule. A little trouble soon to be settled in this city, a slight disturbance in that. The song of the social revolt came to him no more. He never learned that it had been forbidden in the municipal limits, and all the great emotions of the crow's nest slumbered in his mind. But on the second and third of the 3 days he found himself, in spite of his interest in the daughter of the pig manager, or it may be by reason of the thoughts her conversation suggested, remembering the girl Helen Wotton, who had spoken to him so oddly at the wind vane keepers' gathering. The impression she had made was a deep one, albeit the incessant surprise of novel circumstances had kept him from brooding upon it for a space. But now her memory was coming to its own. He wondered what she had meant by those broken, half-forgotten sentences. The picture of her eyes and the earnest passion of her face became more vivid as his mechanical interests faded. Her slender beauty came compellingly between him and certain immediate temptations of ignoble passion. But he did not see her again until 3 full days were past. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Graham Remembers. She came upon him at last in a little gallery that ran from the wind vane offices toward his state apartments. The gallery was long and narrow, with a series of recesses, each with an arched fenestration that looked upon a court of palms. He came upon her suddenly in one of these recesses. She was seated. She turned her head at the sound of his footsteps, and started at the sight of him. Every touch of color vanished from her face. She rose instantly, made a step toward him as if to address him, and hesitated. He stopped and stood still, expectant. Then he perceived that a nervous tumult silenced her, perceived, too, that she must have sought speech with him to be waiting for him in this place. He felt a regal impulse to assist her. "I have wanted to see you," he said. A few days ago, you wanted to tell me something. You wanted to tell me of the people. What was it you had to tell me?" She looked at him with troubled eyes. "You said the people were unhappy?" For a moment she was silent still. "It must have seemed strange to you," she said abruptly. "It did, and yet it was an impulse." "Well, that is all." She looked at him with a face of hesitation. She spoke with an effort. "You forget," she said, drawing a deep breath. "What?" "The people." "Do you mean you forget the people?" He looked interrogative. "Yes, I know you are surprised, for you do not understand what you are. You do not know the things that are happening." "Well?" "You do not understand." "Not clearly, perhaps, but tell me." She turned to him with sudden resolution. "It is so hard to explain. I have meant to, I have wanted to, and now I cannot. I am not ready with words. But about you, there is something. It is wonder. Your sleep, your awakening. These things are miracles. To me at least, and to all the common people. You who have lived and suffered and died, you who were a common citizen, wake again, live again, to find yourself master almost of the world." "Master of the earth," he said. "So they tell me. But try and imagine how little I know of it." "Cities, trusts, the Labor Department." "Principalities, powers, dominions, the power and the glory. Yes, I have heard them shout. I know I am master, king if you wish, with Ostrog, the boss." He paused. She turned upon him and surveyed his face with a curious scrutiny. "Well?" He smiled. "To take the responsibility." "That is what we have begun to fear." For a moment she said no more. "No," she said slowly. "You will take the responsibility. You will take the responsibility. The people look to you." She spoke softly. "Listen. For at least half the years of your sleep, in every generation, multitudes of people, in every generation greater multitudes of people, have prayed that you might awake. Prayed." Graham moved to speak and did not. She hesitated, and a faint color crept back to her cheek. "Do you know that you have been to myriads, King Arthur, Barbarossa, the king who had come in his own good time and put the world right for them?" "I suppose the imagination of the people." "Have you not heard our proverb, 'When the sleeper wakes'? While you lay insensible and motionless there, thousands came. Thousands. Every first of the month you lay in state, with a white robe upon you, and the people filed by you. When I was a little girl, I saw you like that, with your face white and calm." She turned her face from him and looked steadfastly at the painted wall before her. Her voice fell. "When I was a little girl, I used to look at your face. It seemed to me fixed and waiting, like the patience of God." "That is what we thought of you," she said. "That is how you seem to us." She turned her shining eyes to him. Her voice was clear and strong. "In the city, in the earth, a myriad men and women are waiting to see what you will do, full of strange, incredible expectations." "Yes?" "Ostrog, no one can take that responsibility." Graham looked at her in surprise, at her face lit with emotion. She seemed at first to have spoken with an effort, and to have fired herself by speaking. "Do you think," she said, that you who have lived that little life so far away in the past, you who have fallen into and risen out of this miracle of sleep, do you think that the wonder and reverence and hope of half the world has gathered about you only that you may live another little life, that you may shift the responsibility to any other man? I know how great this kingship of mine is, he said haltingly. I know how great it seems, but is it real? It is incredible, dreamlike. Is it real, or is it only a great delusion? It is real, she said, if you dare. After all, like all kingship, my kingship is belief. It is an illusion in the minds of men. If you dare, she said. But countless men, she said, and while it is in their minds, they will obey. But I know nothing. That is what I had in mind. I know nothing. And these others, the counselors, Ostrog, they are wiser, cooler. They know so much, every detail. And, indeed, what are these miseries of which you speak? What am I to know? Do you mean— He stopped blankly. I am still hardly more than a girl, she said, but to me the world seems full of wretchedness. The world has altered since your day, altered very strangely. I have prayed that I might see you and tell you these things. The world has changed, as if a canker had seized it and robbed life of everything worth having. She turned a flushed face upon him, moving suddenly. Your days were the days of freedom. Yes, I have thought. I have been made to think, for my life has not been happy. Men are no longer free. No greater, no better than the men of your time. That is not all. This city is a prison. Every city is now a prison. Mammon grips the key in his hand. Myriads, countless myriads, toil from the cradle to the grave. Is that right? Is that to be forever? Yes, far worse than in your time. All about us, beneath us, sorrow and pain. All the shallow delight of such life as you find about you is separated by just a little from a life of wretchedness beyond any telling. Yes, the poor know it. They know they suffer. These countless multitudes who faced death for you 2 nights since, you owe your life to them. Yes, said Graham slowly. Yes, I owe my life to them. You come, she said, from the days when this new tyranny of the cities was scarcely beginning. It is a tyranny, a tyranny. In your days the feudal warlords had gone, and the new lordship of wealth had still to come. Half the men in the world still lived out upon the free countryside. The cities had still to devour them. I have heard the stories out of the old books. There was nobility. Common men led lives of love and faithfulness then. They did 1,000 things. And you come from that time. It was not. But never mind. How is it now? Gain and the pleasure cities, or slavery, unthanked, unhonored slavery. Slavery, he said. Slavery. You don't mean to say that human beings are chattels? Worse. That is what I want you to know, what I want you to see. I know you do not know. They will keep things from you. They will take you presently to a pleasure city. But you have noticed men and women and children in pale blue canvas, with thin yellow faces and dull eyes, everywhere, speaking a horrible dialect, coarse and weak. I have heard it. They are the slaves, your slaves. They are the slaves of the Labor Department you own. The Labor Department? In some way, that is familiar. Ah, now I remember. I saw it when I was wandering about the city, after the lights returned. Great fronts of buildings colored pale blue. Do you really mean? Yes. How can I explain it to you? Of course the blue uniform struck you. Nearly a third of our people wear it. More assume it now every day. This Labor Department has grown imperceptibly. What is this Labor Department? Asked Graham. In the old days, how did you manage with starving people? There was the workhouse, which the parishes maintained. Workhouse. Yes, there was something. In our history lessons. I remember now. The Labor Department ousted the workhouse. It grew, partly, out of something, you perhaps may remember it, an emotional religious organization called the Salvation Army, that became a business company. In the first place, it was almost a charity, to save people from workhouse rigors. There had been a great agitation against the workhouse. Now I come to think of it, it was one of the earliest properties your trustees acquired. They bought the Salvation Army and reconstructed it as this. The idea, in the first place, was to organize the labor of starving homeless people. Yes. Nowadays there are no workhouses, no refuges and charities, nothing but that department. Its offices are everywhere. That blue is its color, and any man, woman, or child who comes to be hungry and weary and with neither home nor friend nor resort must go to the department in the end, or seek some way of death. The euthanasia is beyond their means. For the poor there is no easy death. And at any hour in the day or night there is food, shelter, and a blue uniform for all comers. That is the first condition of the department's incorporation. And in return for a day's shelter, the department extracts a day's work, and then returns the visitor's proper clothing and sends him or her out again. Yes. Perhaps that does not seem so terrible to you. In your time, men starved in your streets. That was bad. But they died men. These people in blue. The proverb runs, "Blue canvas once and ever." The department trades in their labor, and it has taken care to assure itself of the supply. People come to it starving and helpless. They eat and sleep for a night and day, then work for a day, and at the end of the day they go out again. If they have worked well, they have a penny or so, enough for a theater or a cheap dancing place or a kinematograph story or a dinner or a bet. They wander about after that is spent. Begging is prevented by the police of the ways. Besides, no one gives. They come back again the next day or the day after, brought back by the same incapacity that brought them first. At last their proper clothing wears out, or their rags get so shabby that they are ashamed. Then they must work for months to get fresh, if they want fresh. A great number of children are born under the department's care. The mother owes them a month thereafter. The children they cherish and educate until they are 14, and they pay 2 years' service. You may be sure these children are educated for the blue canvas. And so it is the department works. And none are destitute in the city? None. They are either in blue canvas or in prison. We have abolished destitution. It is engraved on the department's checks. If they will not work? Most people will work at that pitch, and the department has powers. There are stages of unpleasantness in the work, stoppage of food, and a man or woman who has refused to work once is known by a thumb-marking system in the department's offices all over the world. Besides, who can leave the city poor? To go to Paris costs 2 lions. And for insubordination there are the prisons, dark and miserable, out of sight below. There are prisons now for many things. And a third of the people wear this blue canvas? More than a third. Toilers, living without pride or delight or hope, with the stories of the pleasure cities ringing in their ears, mocking their shameful lives, their privations and hardships. Too poor even for the euthanasie, the rich man's refuge from life. Dumb, crippled millions, countless millions, all the world about, ignorant of anything but limitations and unsatisfied desires. They are born, they are thwarted, and they die. That is the state to which we have come. For a space, Graham sat downcast. But there has been a revolution, he said. All these things will be changed. Ostrog, that is our hope. That is the hope of the world. But Ostrog will not do it. He is a politician. To him it seems things must be like this. He does not mind. He takes it for granted. All the rich, all the influential, all who are happy, come at last to take these miseries for granted. They use the people in their politics. They live in ease by their degradation. But you who come from a happier age, it is to you the people look. To you. He looked at her face. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. He felt a rush of emotion. For a moment he forgot this city, he forgot the race, and all those vague, remote voices in the immediate humanity of her beauty. "But what am I to do?" he said with his eyes upon her. "Rule," she answered, bending towards him and speaking in a low tone. "Rule the world as it has never been ruled, for the good and happiness of men. For you might rule it. You could rule it. The people are stirring. All over the world the people are stirring. It wants but a word from you to bring them all together. Even the middle sort of people are restless, unhappy. They are not telling you the things that are happening. The people will not go back to their drudgery. They refuse to be disarmed. Ostrog has awakened something greater than he dreamt of. He has awakened hopes." His heart was beating fast. He tried to seem judicial, to weigh considerations. They only want their leader," she said. And then, "You could do what you would. The world is yours." He sat, no longer regarding her. Presently he spoke. "The old dreams, and the thing I have dreamt, liberty, happiness, are they dreams? Could one man, his voice sank and ceased. "Not one man, but all men. Give them only a leader to speak the desire of their hearts." He shook his head, and for a time there was silence. He looked up suddenly, and their eyes met. "I have not your faith," he said. "I have not your youth. I am here with power that mocks me. No, let me speak. I want to do, not right, I have not the strength for that, but something rather right than wrong. It will bring no millennium, but I am resolved now that I will rule. What you have said has awakened me. You are right. Ostrog must know his place. And I will learn. One thing I promise you, this labor slavery shall end." "And will you rule?" "Yes, provided there is one thing." "Yes?" "That you will help me." "I, a girl?" "Yes. Does it not occur to you I am absolutely alone?" She started, and for an instant her eyes had pity. "Need you ask whether I will help you?" she said. There came a tense silence, and then the beating of a clock striking the hour. Graham rose. "Even now," he said, "Ostrog will be waiting. He hesitated, facing her. "When I have asked him certain questions, there is much I do not know. It may be that I will go to see with my own eyes the things of which you have spoken. And when I return, I shall know of your going and coming. I will wait for you here again." They regarded one another steadfastly, questioningly, and then he turned from her towards the wind vane office. End of chapter 18.